Hello everyone and welcome back to another edition of the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. My name is Christopher Shepard. Thank you guys for tuning in. Happy Monday, happy Labor Day to all those who celebrate. We are still going to be doing a fantasy show for you guys today, and I thought it would be interesting, since we are less than 1 week away from the start of the NFL season, to do a deep dive into certain skill position groups around the league to see which of them gives you the most value. So today we start off in the world of the AFC with teams such as the Bengals and their running back situation, the Broncos as well. Very strong group, a strong trio, in fact, of running backs you could be selecting in fantasy football drafts if you haven't done yours already. Also looking at the LA Chargers becoming the Ravens of the West with their two running backs. And we also will conclude all of our sleepers and busts for this year as well as we round out with the tight ends. But before we get into any of that, I do want to remind you to, now that we are a live show, avail yourselves to all the features that YouTube has to offer, including the Super Chat, Super Thanks, and Super Stickers features as well. Anything you leave for the show, as well as tips and donations, are greatly appreciated, especially with both me, my fellow podcasters. Go check them out as well on both networks, Sports and Podcast Network for GSMC. So yes, anything you do leave is greatly appreciated. You all have been excellent in terms of leaving comments, highly interactive. I want to keep that interaction going before we get into and once we get into the NFL season. But without further ado, let's start off today's show and our week show. Starting off, like I said, in the AFC, doing a deep dive into certain team situations in terms of their skill position groups. We're starting off with the team kind of transitioning to a more committee approach. Perhaps it's the nature of this division in that you see a lot of committee approaches with the Ravens over the years, the Steelers, and maybe now the Browns, since Nick Chubb, we don't know what his situation is. But this team has always seemed to have a solid running back, but now it is different. It is going to be two guys in that backfield getting the bulk of the carries, and it could affect how you value them both in fantasy. They're not necessarily top-end guys. They're not, in fact, even in any of the tiers I mentioned for the running back position, but they are guys who are interesting, say if you are in a super flex league or a high upside PPR league. And when I think about the Bengals offense, I think that there are many opportunities for these two guys to break out. And so we start off with the Cincinnati Bengals. Like I said, they always had Joe Mixon there along with Joe Burrow. Very nice backfield, but now Joe Mixon has gone to the Houston Texans. So they bring in Zack Moss, recently of the Buffalo Bills and Indianapolis Colts, and then rookie Chase Brown coming into his second year. So that's going to be a very interesting backfield. Like I said, two guys not necessarily highly coveted at the running back position, but still add a lot of value. That being said, rumors from camp are that Zack Moss will get the bulk of the carries, and Chase Young will be used in situations where, they can set up the screen game, because I think he is potent in that area. Like I said, in both the run and pass game, both of these guys will look to get a lot of targets, but I think Chase Brown, to that effect, will be more centralized in the pass game. Let's talk about how to compare these two guys stat-wise in terms of their fantasy value as well. So let's start off with Zack Moss. Last year, played with the Indianapolis Colts. Kind of was their backup to Jonathan Taylor, but still got a lot of good minutes, especially after Anthony Richardson went down. 183 carries last year, 794 yards, was 27th in the league, so in the top 30, 986 yards, in fact, from scrimmage. He had 5 touchdowns and a solid, but not necessarily superstar solid, 4.3 yards per carry. So he had 8 starts with the Colts. He actually did have 3 games of 20-plus fantasy points, and he carried the football more than 18 times in 6 of those games that he played. So, as you can see, very well-rounded player. I think that in this Bengals system, he's going to be looking for a lot of red zone touches, perhaps. Maybe more of a power workhorse back. I don't necessarily see him as someone who projects to be quote-unquote elusive. That's kind of where Chase Brown comes in. But at the end of the day, I think that if you are in a fantasy league that's more of a super flex situation, you can definitely implement him because he will have a lot of carries, a lot of production, especially if they view him as someone who can get going early downs. Then we transition to the Chase Brown situation. Last year kind of was a revelation, did not get as many carries in the system because obviously he was sitting behind Joe Mixon. But this year could be his year, especially in the receiving game, because last year he averaged a solid 14.4 yards per reception on screens, 7 touchdowns in fact off of screens for Chase Brown. So if you're looking for someone who's going to get a lot of volume in terms of, say, whether or not you're in a PPR league, then Chase Brown might be the guy for you. But when I look at the Bengals running back room and the running back rooms they've had in the recent past, this is profiling as one that really gets to vary this offense. And if you like teams that spread the ball around in so many different ways, look to the Bengals. Because while these guys, like I said, aren't starting running backs, they are guys who can add value either off your bench as a super flex option, a flex option in regular leagues. But at the end of the day, do be wary that this is the first time where the Bengals are in a new horizon in terms of breaking in running backs. They don't have Joe Mixon as a fallback plan, a guy who combines speed, power, and strength. They have 2 guys now who you're really going to have to look at through the lens of how this offense is going to operate. That being said, if I were to pick one of these guys as someone who could project to move into higher tiers of this offense, and in terms of the running back market, I would say Zack Moss at this current moment in time, because I think that he's more of a traditional style of running back, kind of a physical breed, but he also is able to get into the receiving game a little bit. Whereas Chase Brown is still young. This is only his second year in the league that it's going to be, and he still has the opportunity to work his way into this offense. So he's not there yet. He definitely has perhaps more potential in the long-term future than Zack Moss, but in the short term, look for Zack Moss to be the guy in the Bengals offense and in terms of someone who could rise quickly through the ranks. But now let's talk about the Bengals as a whole and how this could affect them as a team going forward. Because I really think it's going to come down to these 2 guys in terms of the Bengals offense. Because there are going to be moments where, Joe Burrow maybe is going to need to rely on the shorter passing game. Or maybe going to need to rely on the running backs more than usual. Like I said recently in previous episodes, he is working his way back into this offense after the wrist injury. Did not necessarily play all of training camp this past couple of training camp sessions. So he's working his way back into this offense. And as a result, he may be more comfortable just distributing the football to these versatile running backs, especially a guy like Zack Moss who just brings that level of experience. Maybe not the explosiveness of a Joe Mixon, but someone who can solidify the running back position with this poise and composure in terms of how he plays. And Chase Brown as well, especially in later downs in certain situations where it's maybe a 3rd and short, maybe he can get into the screen game as well. But it's all about the comfortability of Joe Burrow working his way back into this offense. And also paying attention to the contract situation. Obviously, like we said, T. Higgins franchise tagged already for at least this 1 year. Now it's all about Jamar Chase. He has sat out a couple of practices as this training camp has progressed. Still has 2 years left on his contract, but this is a situation that I think fantasy football managers, especially those who might be looking at the overall team rather than just one player from the Cincinnati Bengals, a lot of fantasy football managers should be looking at this situation as one to monitor, because if Jamar Chase say, misses a couple of games due to this holdout, then that could make things a little bit more interesting. Throw a wrench, perhaps, into the plans for the Cincinnati Bengals on the offensive side of the football. But back to the running back situation, I think that you can't go wrong if you choose to get these guys on your bench because they are two excellent backs in many different aspects. If you like PPR-like guys, then Chase Brown might be your guy. Maybe not right now immediately. He can still add value and depth right now, but in the long term, look for Chase Brown to grow into someone who you can rely upon in any fantasy league. But Zack Moss certainly is the more interesting of the two because right now he feels like a guy who is the perfect embodiment of a committee approach, but he also has the ability to not necessarily pad his stats, I wouldn't call it, but has the ability to have a breakout season and be kind of a security blanket for an offense much like the Bengals. But let me know what you think in the comments, whether or not you are liking the profile of this Bengals running back room, because it's a different approach for them. It's something that they haven't necessarily had, and it's a new experiment. I think that it could work for them in the long run because of the fact it alleviates some of the pressure and burden on Joe Burrow to get more vertical, and it kind of makes this offense a little bit more unpredictable in a good way. But that is, of course, whether or not this whole contract dispute with Jamar Chase can get solved. Because if it isn't, that's a little bit worrying if you are a Cincinnati Bengals fan or if you're a fantasy football manager who is looking at the Bengals as a team that you really like. But I don't know. Let me know what you think in the comments. That should just about do it for this segment. Thank you guys all for tuning in. We'll be back after this short break to talk about another running back room, a trio this time in the AFC West. That could be very interesting. Like we said, we'll be right back after this short break.